They came for me on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was the day I washed my hair, one of the few small things that was still mine. I remember the smell of the rose water I used to rinse it. I remember standing in the courtyard, letting the sun dry it, thinking how strange it was that the sky could be so blue on the day your family decides you should die. My brother was first through the gate, then my uncle, then my father, last, like a judge entering a courtroom. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the ground, and somehow that was worse than if he'd looked at me with rage. Rage, I understood. That silence, that was sentencing. "We know," my father said. 3 words, that was all. I didn't ask what they knew. I didn't run. I think part of me had always known this moment was coming, had been waiting for it, the way you wait for a storm you can smell in the air for days before it arrives. I just stood there, water still dripping from the ends of my hair onto the dust, and I thought, so this is how it ends. But let me take you back, because you need to understand what kind of world could produce a moment like that. You need to understand the world I was born into, not as a person, but as a problem. I was born female in a place where that alone was an apology. My mother told me once, I must have been 5 or 6, that when I came into the world, the room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the kind that falls over people when something disappointing happens. My father had walked out without holding me. My grandmother had clicked her tongue. Only my mother had wept, and even then, I understand now, she was weeping for both of us. Another girl, they had said, another mouth, another burden, another risk. By the time I was 12, I understood exactly what I was worth in our household. I was worth less than my brother's reputation, less than my father's standing at the mosque, less than the opinion of men I would never meet, making decisions in rooms I would never enter, about a life I would never truly own. I was property. And property does not have dreams. Property does not ask questions. Property does not, under any circumstances, pick up a Bible. But I did, and that changed everything. My father's name meant noble in Arabic. I used to think about that when I was small, how a name that meant something so beautiful could belong to someone so cold. He wasn't a monster in the way movies show monsters. He didn't foam at the mouth. He didn't scream constantly. That almost would have been easier. No, my father was worse than that. He was quiet, controlled. A man who believed with his whole chest that he was righteous, that everything he did for honor, for Allah, for the family name. Men like that are the most dangerous kind, because they never doubt themselves, not even for a moment. I was 13 when he called me into the main room and told me I was getting married. I remember I had flour on my hands. I'd been helping my mother with bread, one of the few spaces where she and I could exist together without the weight of everything else pressing down on us. The kitchen was ours, warm, smelling of cumin and yeast and something almost like safety. And then my mother's eyes had gone to the floor, and she'd said, softly, "Go, your father is calling." She knew. She had known before I did, and she had still been kneading that dough, still working her hands in steady circles, like if she just kept moving, she wouldn't have to feel what she was allowing to happen. I have spent years trying to forgive her for that. I walked into the main room, and my father was sitting with a man I didn't recognize. He was older, much older. His beard was more gray than black. His hands on his knees were thick and weathered. He looked at me the way you look at something you are considering purchasing, appraising, detached, already calculating value. My father didn't introduce me. He said, "This is her," not, "This is my daughter," not my name, just, "This is her." Like I was a piece of furniture he was showing to a buyer. I stood there with flowers still on my hands, and something inside me, something young and soft and still hopeful, cracked so quietly that no one in that room heard it but me. "Baba," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Who is this?" "Your future husband," he said. "You marry in 6 weeks." I looked at my mother standing in the doorway. I begged her with my eyes, the way daughters beg mothers, silently, desperately, in a language only the two of you share. "Please, say something. Stop this. You're my mother. Aren't you my mother?" She looked back at her hands. "But Baba," my voice broke. "He's how old?" My father's eyes cut to me like a blade. "You will not ask questions. You will prepare yourself. You will be grateful someone wants you." Grateful. He said grateful. The man on the cushion smiled at me then, a slow, patient smile, like he had all the time in the world, because he did, because I had none. I was 13 years old. My childhood didn't end that day. It was confiscated, taken from me by 2 men sitting on cushions, drinking tea, while my mother stood in a doorway and said nothing, and the bread in the kitchen began, slowly, to burn. Sister, if you are watching this, and you have ever stood in a room where your future was being decided without you, where your voice didn't matter, where your pain was irrelevant, where your presence was the only thing required of you, then you already know how I felt. You already know that particular silence. That was the day I understood. I was not a daughter. I was not a person. I was a transaction. And the men in that room had just agreed on the price. I prayed 5 times a day without fail. I want you to understand that. I was not a careless girl. I was not rebellious, not then. I believed, genuinely, deeply, with everything in me. I believed that if I was obedient enough, humble enough, small enough, Allah would see me, would hear me, would reach down into my small, suffocating life and do something. I pressed my forehead to that prayer mat so many times it left a mark on my skin. I whispered dua in the dark after everyone else was asleep, my lips barely moving, my hands cupped in front of me like I was trying to hold water that kept slipping through my fingers. I fasted beyond what was required. I covered myself completely, even in the heat of summer, even when the wool made my scalp itch and sweat ran down the back of my neck. I did everything right, and the silence I received in return was deafening. There is a particular loneliness that belongs only to women in systems that were never built for them. I don't know if men can fully understand it, the loneliness of being told that your testimony is worth half of a man's, that your inheritance is half of your brother's, that paradise itself sits beneath your husband's feet, and so you must make yourself agreeable to a man who looks at you like livestock, or risk losing eternity. What do you do with a faith that tells you your suffering is your purpose? You endure it. You fold yourself smaller. You pray harder. And when the prayers bounce back unanswered, you assume the problem is you. That was what I believed for years, that my pain was my own fault, that if Allah was silent, it was because I wasn't worthy enough of His attention. So I tried harder. I memorized more surahs. I asked the older women in our neighborhood what I was doing wrong, and they would pat my hand and say, "Be patient. Allah tests those He loves. Be patient." I was 13, then 14, then 15, by then already a wife, already living in a house that didn't feel like a home, already sleeping beside a man who smelled of tobacco and entitlement. And every morning I would rise before dawn and press my forehead to that mat and whisper, "Please, please, someone see me, someone hear me." Nothing. The women around me seemed to have made a kind of peace with the silence. My mother-in-law moved through her days like a woman who had simply stopped expecting anything from God or man, a controlled emptiness behind her eyes that terrified me because I could see my future in it. My own mother, when I was allowed to visit, had the same look, like something that once burned brightly in them had been carefully, methodically extinguished over decades of endurance. I used to watch them and think, is that what surviving looks like? Because if it was, if that hollowness was the reward for a lifetime of obedience, then I wasn't sure I wanted to survive. There were nights I lay on the floor of the bathroom, the only room with a lock, the only square meters in that entire house that were briefly, conditionally mine, and I pressed my back against the cold tile and let myself cry without sound. Women like us learn early how to cry without making noise. You swallow it. You shake without shaking. You let tears run sideways into your hair rather than down your face, so there's no evidence afterward. I cried for the girl with flour on her hands who had stood in that room. I cried for my mother who hadn't spoken. I cried for the version of myself I was slowly becoming. Quiet, hollow, obedient in the way that broken things are obedient. And then I would wash my face with cold water, look in the mirror, adjust my hijab, and go back out to be whatever was required of me that day. Sister, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible to God? Not doubting He exists, but doubting that He sees you specifically. That maybe you are too small, too female, too damaged, too far gone for Him to bother with. I lived in that feeling for years. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined lying on that cold tile floor, was that there was another God entirely who had been watching me the whole time. One who didn't require my smallness, one who didn't rank my testimony below my brother's, one who, very soon, was going to find me in the most unexpected way. It came to me through a woman named Fatima, which still makes me smile, even now. Of all the names, Fatima, the most beloved name in our world, the Prophet's own daughter, and she was the one who handed me the thing that would unravel everything. She was my neighbor, older than me by perhaps 20 years, quiet in the way that hides depth rather than emptiness. She had kind eyes and rough hands, and she always smelled faintly of cardamom. We would sometimes sit together on the shared wall between our courtyards in the late afternoon, that in-between hour when the men were elsewhere and the world briefly exhaled. She never asked me too many questions. She just sat with me. And sometimes that is the most radical thing one woman can do for another. One afternoon, she pressed something into my hand as I was leaving. It was small, thin, wrapped in a plain piece of cloth, like something precious being smuggled. She closed my fingers around it and held my hand in both of hers for a moment and said, very quietly, "Read it when you're alone. Don't tell anyone I gave it to you." I didn't open it until that night, on the bathroom floor with the door locked, by the thin crack of light coming under the door, because I was afraid to turn on the light fully in case someone noticed. It was a New Testament, tiny, the pages almost translucent, the kind of thin that makes paper feel like breath. Arabic translation, and on the inside cover, in handwriting that wasn't Fatima's, someone had written, "She is worth more than rubies." I stared at those words for a long time, then I opened to a random page, just wherever my thumb fell, and I found myself in the middle of a story about a woman, a Samaritan woman, standing at a well in the middle of the day, alone. The kind of alone that means the other women have made clear she isn't welcome among them. An outcast, shameful history, multiple husbands, the kind of woman that respectable people stepped around. And Jesus was talking to her, not at her, not about her, to her, directly, with full attention, asking her questions like her answers mattered, like she mattered. I read it 3 times, then I read it again. In the world I came from, A man of standing did not speak to a woman like that in public. He certainly didn't engage her theologically. He didn't ask for her perspective. He didn't offer her anything. Women received. They didn't receive from. And this woman, this outcast with her shameful history, this woman who came to the well at noon to avoid the others, Jesus had sat down with her and spoken to her like she was worth the conversation. His own disciples were shocked when they returned and found them talking. The text didn't hide that. It acknowledged their surprise, and then it just moved past it, as if Jesus found their shock mildly irrelevant. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth. Something was happening in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. A loosening, like a knot being worked free that has been pulled so tight for so long you'd forgotten it was a knot. You thought it was just the shape of you. I kept reading. I read about the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years of being considered unclean, untouchable, invisible under religious law, who pressed through a crowd just to touch the hem of his garment. And when she did, Jesus stopped. In the middle of a crowd, with an important man's dying daughter waiting, Jesus stopped, and he asked who had touched him, not to punish her, but because he wanted to see her face. He wanted to call her daughter. He wanted the healing to be witnessed, to be public, to be spoken out loud so she couldn't be dismissed as imagining it. He made her story undeniable. Sister, do you understand what that meant to me? A woman whose testimony was worth half a man's under the law I'd grown up with, reading about a God who stopped crowds for women, who spoke theology to outcasts at wells, who let a woman of questionable reputation wash his feet with her hair, and rebuked the men who objected. I read until the light under the door disappeared, and the house went fully silent. Then I lay on my back on that cold tile floor, with the little book resting on my chest, right over my heart, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark. The war inside me was immediate and violent. Everything I'd been taught rose up at once. This is haram. This is a corruption. This is the trap of the enemies of Islam. You are a wife. You are a Muslim. You are... But underneath all of that, quieter, steadier, like a voice speaking from somewhere below the noise. What if you are worth more than you've been told? I slid the little book under the loose tile in the corner, the one that had always rocked slightly underfoot. I pressed it flat, replaced the tile, stood up, looked at myself in the mirror. My hijab was slightly askew from lying on the floor. My eyes were swollen. I looked exhausted and terrified and alive. For the first time in a long time, I looked like someone who had a secret worth protecting. I fixed my hijab, unlocked the door, walked back into my life, but I was already, without fully knowing it, walking towards something else entirely. It happened on a night when I had nothing left. I need you to understand what nothing left means for a woman like I was then. It doesn't mean sad. It doesn't mean tired. It means you have been so thoroughly emptied by years of endurance, by silence, by smallness, by the daily work of surviving inside a life that was never yours, that you stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a function, a body that cooks and cleans and submits and endures, a vessel, a shadow. That night, something had happened that I won't describe in detail because some wounds are still tender, even now. What I will tell you is that I lay on the floor of that bathroom again, my floor, my cold tiles, my only square meters, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I was past crying. I just lay there, completely still, and I thought with a clarity that frightened me, I cannot do this anymore, not dramatically, not as a threat or a plea, just as a simple, quiet fact, the way you might observe that a cup is empty. There is nothing left. I am done. I don't know why I reached for the little book. I had read it so many times by then that certain passages had taken up permanent residence in my chest. But my hands found it in the dark, without thinking, the way your hands find things they've reached for many times before. I held it against me. I didn't even open it. I just held it. And I whispered, barely sound at all, just breath shaped into words. If you're real, if you actually see women like me, please, I need you to show me. What happened next I have tried to describe many times and always fail, because human language was built for human experience, and what happened was neither. The room didn't change. There was no light from the ceiling, no thunder, no dramatic wind. But the atmosphere shifted in a way I cannot explain, except to say that the air became different, thick with something that was not fear. I had lived with fear for so long that I knew its texture intimately, and this was not that. This was the opposite of that. This was the feeling of being held. And then I was aware of a presence. I know how that sounds. I know. But I am telling you what happened, and I will not diminish it to make it easier to believe. There was a presence in that small locked bathroom that was more real than the cold tile under my back, more solid than the walls around me. And I heard, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper than ears, a voice. It didn't boom. It didn't command. It was the quietest voice I had ever encountered, and somehow that made it the most powerful. The way a candle in a completely dark room doesn't need to be a floodlight to illuminate everything. It said, "Daughter, not woman, not wife, not the name my husband used when he wanted something, and not the silence he gave me when he didn't, not the disappointment in my father's eyes the day I was born, not the half-testimony, the half-inheritance, the half-personhood I had been assigned by systems older than my grandmother's grandmother. Daughter." I pressed the book harder against my chest, and tears ran sideways into my hair, silently, the way I had taught myself, and the voice continued, and I will tell you what it said as precisely as I can, because these words rewrote something fundamental in my architecture. You were never property. You were never a burden. You were never less. I made you, and I know what I made, and what I made was precious. What was done to you was done against my heart. Every night you cried on this floor, I was here. Every prayer that felt unanswered, I heard. I was not the God who required your smallness. I was never that. You were told wrong. You were taught wrong. And I am here now to tell you the truth. You are seen, fully, completely, not despite being a woman, because of who you are, exactly as you are. I want to stop here for a moment and speak directly to you, sister, because maybe you are watching this and you have been told by religion, by culture, by a father or a husband or a system that your gender is your limitation, that being female is something to be managed, contained, apologized for. I need you to hear what I heard on that floor. That was never God speaking. That was men. The presence I felt that night. I understand now it was Jesus. The same Jesus who stopped for the bleeding woman, who sat with the outcast at the well, who appeared first to a woman after his resurrection, when he could have appeared to anyone. He chose women to carry the most important news in human history, when the entire culture said women's testimony couldn't be trusted. That is not a coincidence. That is a statement. He knelt into my smallness that night. He didn't stand over me the way every man in my life had stood over me, tall, requiring, taking up space that should have been mine. He came down. He made himself low, the way he always did with women in the Gospels, and he met me exactly where I was, on a cold tile floor with a bruised body and an empty soul. And he filled me, not with instructions, not with a list of requirements, not with conditions I had to meet before I deserved his attention. He filled me with the staggering, incomprehensible, rearranging knowledge that I was loved, not useful, loved, not tolerated, cherished, not a function or a vessel or a transaction, a daughter. I lay there for a long time after. I don't know how long. The house was silent around me. Eventually, I became aware again of the cold tile, the thin light, the familiar sounds of the night outside. Everything was exactly the same, and I was completely, irrevocably different. I had walked into that bathroom a woman who was finished. I walked out a woman who had just begun. They found the Bible on a Thursday, not Fatima's fault. Not mine, exactly, or maybe mine, because by then I had grown careless, in the way that people grow careless when they have found something worth living for. I had been reading more openly, staying in the bathroom longer, whispering prayers in a language that wasn't Arabic to a God with a different name than the one on everyone's lips in that house. I think part of me wanted to be found, not out of recklessness, out of a new and terrifying thing that had taken root in my chest since that night on the floor, something that felt like dignity. And dignity, once it wakes up in a woman who has never had it, is extraordinarily difficult to put back to sleep. It was my mother-in-law who found it. She had come into the bathroom while I was in the kitchen. I had been careless with the tile, hadn't pressed it completely flat. And when I came back to the room, I found her standing in the middle of the floor, holding it in both hands, the way you hold something contaminated. Her face was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was afraid. And in our world, a frightened woman is more dangerous than an angry man, because a frightened woman goes to the men. She didn't speak to me. She just looked at me with those afraid eyes and walked out of the room with my little book in her hands, and I stood there and felt the floor shift beneath my feet, like the moment before an earthquake, when the world hasn't started shaking yet, but something in the air tells you it's coming. My husband came home that evening, and I knew from the way he walked through the door, too controlled, too deliberate, the specific stillness of a man containing something large, that she had told him. He placed the Bible on the table between us. "Explain this," he said. I looked at the little book on the table. Its cover was worn now from all my handling, the pages soft with use. It looked like what it was, something deeply read, deeply loved, evidence of an inner life he had never been able to fully colonize. I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But underneath the terror, steady and warm, like an ember that refuses to go out, was something I had never felt in this house before. I was not ashamed. "It's a Bible," I said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. He hit the table with his palm, not me, not yet, just the table, and the little book jumped. "You brought this filth into my house. You have been reading this. You..." He stopped, collected himself, and then, more quietly, more dangerously, "Have you converted, sister?" I want to tell you that I was brave in that moment, that I stood tall and declared my faith fearlessly. But the truth is more complicated than that, because the truth usually is. I was shaking. My hands were behind my back, so he couldn't see them trembling. My heart was slamming against my ribs. But I thought of the woman at the well. I thought of the bleeding woman pressing through the crowd. I thought of a voice in the dark that had called me daughter and meant it. And I said, yes. One word, the most dangerous word I had ever spoken, the truest thing I had said out loud in years. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he picked up the Bible and left the room. I heard him on the phone, his voice low, controlled, the specific cadence of a man making arrangements. I stood in that kitchen and I prayed with everything in me, silently, urgently. Jesus, I just did what I thought you wanted. I need you to be here right now. Please. My husband's brother arrived within the hour, then a cousin I hadn't seen in months, and then my father. I hadn't seen my father in weeks. He walked in and looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had only ever seen there once before. On the day he had announced my marriage, across the room from me, looking at the floor instead of my face. Shame. Not for what had been done to me. Shame of me. Shame for me, for being the kind of woman who had done this to his name. They spoke in low voices in the main room for a long time. I stood in the kitchen, and I could hear the shape of the conversation without hearing the words, the rhythms of men deciding a woman's fate, a sound I had known my whole life. My mother-in-law came to the kitchen doorway. She looked at me for a long moment, and then, quietly, with something in her face I still can't fully name, not quite guilt, not quite compassion, somewhere between the two, she said, "You should have been more careful." It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive from her. My husband came back into the kitchen with his brother behind him, and his eyes were no longer controlled. The careful stillness was gone. What replaced it was something I recognized. I had learned to recognize it early, the way animals learn to recognize weather, and I pressed my back against the counter and I prayed harder. His brother was holding something at his side. I looked at it the way you look at things your mind doesn't want to process. Long and thin, catching the kitchen light. "You shamed us," my husband said. His voice was almost gentle. That was the worst part, the gentleness. "You brought this into my house. You left Islam. You made us all unclean." I thought of every prayer I had ever pressed into a mat, every dawn I had risen obediently, every part of myself I had folded away to make room for their comfort. I thought of a presence on a cold tile floor that had called me by name. I closed my eyes. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I did something I cannot fully explain even now. I simply, completely surrendered. Not to them, not to the knife, not to the verdict those men had reached in the next room about my life and my worth. I surrendered to him. "I'm yours," I said inside myself. "Whatever happens, I'm yours." And then the door burst open. It was Fatima. Of course it was Fatima. She came through that door like something sent, rather than something arrived, breathing hard, wild-eyed, a woman who had clearly been running, her abaya twisted slightly to one side, her headscarf loosened. She looked nothing like the calm, cardamom-scented neighbor who sat with me on the courtyard wall in the late afternoons. She looked like a woman on a mission from somewhere higher than herself. Behind her was another woman I didn't recognize, younger, sharp eyes, a phone in her hand. Everything happened very fast after that, and very slow, simultaneously, the way traumatic moments exist in 2 time frames at once. My husband's brother stepped back, not because he was afraid of 2 women. Men like him were never afraid of women, but because Fatima had said something as she entered, loudly and clearly, that changed the geometry of the room. She had said, "I have already called. They are already coming. Whatever happens in this house in the next 5 minutes will be witnessed and recorded." The young woman behind her held up her phone. There are things that exist even inside the most closed systems, cracks, thin places where outside light gets in. The world had changed enough, even in our neighborhood, that the presence of a camera and a phone number already dialed introduced a variable these men hadn't calculated. Not enough to make them good, not enough to make them safe, but enough, barely enough, to make them hesitate. And sometimes, hesitation is the only miracle you need. Fatima crossed the kitchen to me without looking at the men. She took my face in both her rough hands, those cardamom and hard work hands, and she looked at me with an intensity that I can only describe as fierce love, the kind that has made a decision and will not be unmade. "Can you walk?" she said. I nodded. "Then walk." She took my hand and we walked out of that kitchen, and I did not look back. I want to tell you I was noble about it, that I swept out with my head high and my heart resolved. The truth is, I was shaking so hard I could barely feel my feet on the floor. The truth is, Fatima was essentially holding me upright. The truth is, I walked past my father, standing in the doorway to the main room, and I looked at his face for what I knew was the last time, and I felt everything, all at once. The 13-year-old with flour on her hands. The girl who had pressed her forehead to the prayer mat, begging to be seen. The daughter who had wanted, so desperately and so uselessly, to be loved by this man the way fathers in other lives loved their daughters. He didn't stop us. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and something passed between us that I don't have clean words for. Not forgiveness, not yet. That would come much later and much harder. But perhaps recognition. Perhaps some buried part of him knew, in that moment, that what was happening was wrong. Or perhaps he was simply calculating risk. I will never know. I released the need to know it on that threshold, and I walked through the door. The night air hit my face, and I gasped like a woman surfacing from water. Fatima's car, battered, reliable, hers, was running at the curb. The young woman with the phone was already inside. We got in and we drove, and I watched my husband's house disappear in the side mirror, and I felt something I had no name for yet. I would learn later that Fatima had been watching for months, that she herself had come to faith years before, quietly, privately, in the way women in our world do everything that matters, and that she had recognized in me the same hunger she had once felt herself, that the Bible she gave me had been given to her by another woman who had received it from another woman still, a chain of small rebellions stretching back through hands I would never know, but felt connected to nonetheless. Women saving women, quietly, at great personal risk, in kitchens and courtyards and bathrooms, one thin, translucent paged book at a time. We drove for several hours. I don't know the exact route. Fatima was careful, doubling back, taking roads I didn't recognize. The young woman with the phone, her name was Noor, I learned, which means light, and I have never forgotten that, was making calls in a low voice, coordinating something larger than the three of us in that car. There was a network. I hadn't known it existed, but it did. Women who helped women like me. Safe houses, some run by churches, some by organizations I'd never heard of. People who understood that sometimes leaving requires infrastructure, that courage alone doesn't get you across a border, or into a shelter, or out of a system designed to keep you contained. I had nothing with me. No documents, no money, no bag. I was wearing what I'd been wearing in the kitchen, house clothes, house slippers, a hijab I had put on that morning out of pure habit. I remember looking down at my feet in those slippers in Fatima's car and almost laughing at the absurdity of it. I had just walked away from my entire life in house slippers. We stopped once, briefly, at a house I didn't know. A woman I'd never met opened the door before we even knocked. She had been waiting, and handed me a bag with clothes, documents, water, food. She held my hands for a moment when she passed it to me and said, "You are not alone. Keep going." She didn't know me. She owed me nothing. She helped me anyway. I wept in the car after that. The first real weeping since the bathroom floor. Not the silent, sideways tears kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere deep and long compressed and cannot be managed. Fatima drove and let me cry and didn't tell me to stop, didn't tell me to be quiet or strong or grateful. She just drove and occasionally reached over and put her hand briefly on mine. That simple gesture, a woman's hand on mine, saying, "I'm here, keep going," undid me completely and rebuilt me simultaneously. Somewhere in those hours of driving, in the dark, moving away from everything I had known, I talked to Jesus out loud for the first time. Not in a whisper, not through a locked door, out loud, in a car moving through the night with two women who understood. I said, "I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what's ahead. I have nothing." And then I stopped, because what came next surprised me. "I have you." That was all. That was enough. There were losses I hadn't fully felt yet. They would come later, in waves, at unexpected moments. The loss of my mother, who had chosen silence over me and would continue to. The loss of the fantasy of a father who might have loved me differently. The loss of a community, a language spoken on familiar streets, the smell of certain foods that would never again mean safety, the loss of the girl I might have been in a different life, the one who got to grow up slowly and choose her own story. Those griefs were real. I won't pretend the escape was only relief. It was relief and devastation braided together so tightly I couldn't always tell which was which. But underneath both of them, running steadier and deeper than either, I was free. Not free the way people mean it casually, the way it gets used in songs and speeches. Free in the way that a woman who has never owned herself suddenly does. Free in the terrifying, exhilarating, wide-open way of someone who has just been handed a life and told, "This one is yours. Choose what to do with it." As the sun began to rise, pale gold at the edges of the horizon, the kind of dawn that looks like a beginning because it is, I looked out the window and I thought of that woman at the well, her outcast life, her complicated history, her midday solitude, and how she had run back to her village after meeting Jesus, not with a plan or a theology or a perfectly formed testimony, but with just one thing to say: "Come and see." That was 3 years ago. I want to pause on that for a moment, because sometimes I still can't believe it myself. 3 years. I say it out loud sometimes just to hear it. 3 years. The way you repeat something extraordinary to make it real. 3 years of waking up in the morning and belonging to no one but God and myself. 3 years of making small, ordinary choices: what to eat, what to wear, when to sleep, where to go, that are so mundane they would bore anyone who hadn't spent years being denied them. 3 years of slowly, painstakingly learning what it means to be a person. I won't tell you it has been easy. I won't package my healing into something cleaner than it is, because you deserve the truth, and the truth is that freedom is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a much harder, much more beautiful one. There were nights in the first year when I woke up gasping, convinced I was back in that house. Nights when the smell of certain food or the sound of a particular tone of voice sent me back so completely that I had to press my palms flat on whatever surface was near me and remind myself, "You are here, you are safe, you are free." There were days I felt the grief of everything I had lost so acutely that the freedom felt less like a gift and more like a wound, because loss is loss, even when what you've lost was destroying you, even when leaving was the only way to survive. I grieved my mother for a long time. I still do, in certain quiet moments. Not the mother she was, the woman who stood in doorways and said nothing while her daughter's childhood was traded away. I grieve the mother she might have been, the mother I needed, the mother I believe, somewhere inside her, she wanted to be, but had been too broken, too afraid, too thoroughly trained into her own smallness to become. I have asked Jesus to help me forgive her. It is an ongoing conversation. Some days I am further along than others. I have forgiven my father too, or I am forgiving him, which is different, which is daily, which is a choice I make again and again, rather than a door I walked through once. I understand now that he was a man shaped by generations of men before him. All of them taught that women were a category rather than a collection of souls. That doesn't make what he did acceptable. It doesn't erase the girl with flour on her hands or the 13-year-old in the white dress. But it makes him human, and it releases me from carrying him. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a gift you give your oppressor. It is a gift you give yourself. Here is what Jesus has healed in me, because I want to be specific. I want to name it the way it deserves to be named. He healed my relationship with my own body. I spent so many years inside a body that felt like a liability, something to be covered, controlled, tested, used, something that existed for everyone else's purposes. I used to flinch when I passed a mirror. I used to dress in the dark. Slowly, over months and years of prayer and community and patient grace, I have learned to inhabit myself, to be present in my own skin without shame. I am still learning, but I look in mirrors now. That is not a small thing. He healed my voice. For years I spoke only when spoken to, and even then I measured every word for danger before releasing it. My voice was a liability. Silence was survival. Learning to speak, to express opinions, to disagree, to say no and mean it, and not collapse afterward waiting for the consequences, has been one of the most profound and disorienting gifts of my new life. I still sometimes catch myself shrinking mid-sentence, but I finish the sentence now. He healed my understanding of what love is. I had experienced love only as possession, as control dressed in the language of protection. I had to learn from scratch, through scripture, through community, through the terrifying practice of letting people be kind to me without immediately searching for what they wanted in return. That love is not a cage. That love does not require your smallness to feel large. That the God who created me did not do so in order to limit me, but to know me, to be known by me in return. That is still the most revolutionary idea I have ever encountered. God wants to be known by me, not served, not feared into compliance, not appeased with rituals performed from a posture of worthlessness. Known in the way that two beings who see each other clearly, fully, without pretense, know each other. I have a church community now, small, diverse, imperfect in all the ways human communities are imperfect. There is a woman there who reminds me a little of Fatima. Same steady eyes, same rough-handed warmth. And sometimes I sit beside her in services and feel the continuity of it, the chain of women stretching backward and forward, the way grace moves through hands. I have work I love. I study. I am building a life that is mine in a way I don't have enough words for. And I have this testimony, this story, these words, which I offer to you now, not as a finished thing, but as an ongoing one. I am not healed and packaged and resolved. I am a woman in process, being made new in real time, stumbling forward in the faith that the voice I heard on that bathroom floor was telling the truth. So now I need to speak directly to you, not to everyone watching, to you specifically, the woman who clicked on this video for a reason she might not fully understand yet, the one who is still inside the life I described, the one who prays 5 times a day and feels nothing, the one who wears the bruises under long sleeves in summer, the one who was sold or traded or told her entire life that she exists to serve a system that was never designed to see her. The one lying on a cold tile floor somewhere right now, wondering if any God anywhere actually cares about women like her. I need you to hear this from someone who is exactly where you are. He sees you, not the version of you that is useful, not the version that is obedient or compliant or sufficiently covered or appropriately small. You, the full, complicated, exhausted, longing, specific you, with your particular history and your particular wounds and your particular dreams that you have probably stopped letting yourself dream. He sees her too, that girl, the one you buried to survive. She is not gone. She is waiting. The Jesus I met on that bathroom floor is not the Jesus of empires or crusades or religious systems that oppress in his name. He is the Jesus who stopped crowds for bleeding women, who sat at wells with outcasts, who appeared first, to a woman on the morning of the resurrection, in a world that said her testimony didn't count. He chose her anyway. He always chooses the ones the world has decided don't count. He chose me. He is choosing you. If you are ready to talk to him, right now, wherever you are, whatever you're wearing, whatever you've done or had done to you, you can simply say this: Jesus, I don't know if you're real, but I know I'm desperate. I know I'm tired. I know I was told I was worth nothing, and something in me has never fully believed it. And I think that something might be you. Show me who I am to you. Show me what love without chains feels like. I am here. I am listening. That's all. That's enough. He will do the rest. He has always been better at the rest than we give him credit for. To Fatima, wherever you are, you handed a drowning woman a rope and didn't wait to be thanked. You are woven into everything good that has happened to me since. I pray for you every day. To the woman who handed me a bag at a door in the middle of the night and said you are not alone, I believed you. It made all the difference. To my mother, I forgive you. I release you. I pray that something finds you on a floor somewhere and calls you daughter too. You deserve that. You still do. And to you, sister, watching this, carrying whatever you're carrying, come and see. The water he offers never runs out. The well is open, and he is already there, waiting to meet you, not because you earned it, because you are his.